This presentation will be on the epidemiology of bacterial meningitis. Epidemiology is the study of human disease and public health. It's particularly focused on occurrence, transmission, distribution, prevention, and control. Epidemiology is vital for our safety because it allows us to know as much as we can about these diseases. If we look at the word bacterial meningitis, it can be broken up into medical terminology. So we get two word parts, meningo meaning meninges or membrane, and then we have itis, which means inflammation. So this disease would be inflammation of the meninges or cerebrospinal fluid caused by a bacterial species. If you look into the picture on the left, we have the pia mater, arachnoid matter, and dura mater. These are the meninges of the brain that would get inflamed if this person has contracted bacterial meningitis. And the symptoms of bacterial meningitis have been described by the CDC to be nausea, vomiting, photophobia, which is a sensitivity to light, and an altered mental state, which could be confusion or a type of psychosis. And these symptoms would typically develop within 3 to 7 days after contracting the disease. Many doctors don't really look to bacterial meningitis as being the first cause of a patient's ailment, which is why it can be so destructive and cause lifelong neurological defects or sometimes death if it goes untreated. So throughout this presentation, I'll go through the epidemiology of bacterial meningitis by explaining how often it occurs, how it's transmitted, and how to prevent an outbreak or contracting the disease yourself. Looking at the occurrence of bacterial meningitis, the CDC states that in between the years 2003 and 2007, there were about 4,100 cases and 500 deaths each year. Another statistic from the CDC states that there are about 1.2 million cases of bacterial meningitis a year worldwide. An area that is seriously affected by bacterial meningitis is called the meningitis belt. It consists of 26 countries across Africa, ranging from Senegal to Ethiopia. This area regularly experiences reoccurring epidemics during their quote-unquote dry season, which is the first half of the year from January to about the end of June. Every year, this puts about 350 million people at risk in the meningitis belt. Now this slide shows the leading causes of bacterial meningitis. Right here we have Streptococcus pneumoniae, Neisseria meningitidis, Haemophilus influenzae, also known as Hib, and Listeria monocytogenes. And I'll talk more about them throughout this presentation. Looking at the transmission of bacterial meningitis, it can be transmitted in multiple ways. In fact, some people can be carriers of this disease and not even exhibit any symptoms, but still spread the bacteria. Mothers are able to pass down certain bacterial species to their babies during birth, such as B. streptococcus. And some species, such as Hib and Streptococcus pneumoniae, can be transmitted by coughing or sneezing while in close contact with others. And then Neisseria meningitidis can be spread through throat secretions such as saliva. And Listeria monocytogenes can be contracted through contaminated foods. Risks of secondary infections are high for those in close contact to an infected person. So it is pretty contagious. Before we fully go into prevention and control, let's take a look at the virulence factors. So what is a virulence factor? They are properties a pathogen has that makes it more equipped to causing disease. And if we look into these three specific bacterial species, we can see their virulence factors that make it harder to treat and get rid of. So in meningitis, they can either be encapsulated or unencapsulated bacteria. However, all the invasive forms really do have encapsulated shell around the bacteria. And usually when they're unencapsulated, they have a polysaccharide coat around it. And then there are 12 serogroups or different types of this bacteria. And then we have H. influenzae or Hib. They can also be encapsulated or unencapsulated, and they're broken into 6 serogroups. And then S. pneumoniae are pretty much all encapsulated, and there are more than 93 serogroups, and most of those are capable of causing an invasive disease. There are many issues with antimicrobial resistance when treating bacterial meningitis, and because of this, chemoprophylaxis is not a recommended form of treatment. In fact, the World Health Organization states that the 2015 epidemic in the meningitis belt was likely due to evolutionary changes in the bacterial species. So for these reasons of the bacteria's resistance to antibiotics and its evolutionary changes, this disease is pretty hard to treat after the fact of getting it. So instead, the best prevention and control we can do is vaccinate. Right now, there are vaccinations for 3 of these bacterial species, which are N. meningitis, S. pneumoniae, and Hib. The CDC mentions that conjugate vaccines have also had a substantial effect because they last longer and result in a higher percentage of protection. As well as the World Health Organization has seen a dramatic decrease in bacterial meningitis cases in the meningitis belt since taking the initiative to vaccinate people. And not only have vaccines decreased the number of bacterial meningitis cases, but the CDC said that introducing vaccines has decreased the antibiotic resistance of a portion of invasive species, which is basically killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Just a recap on what we learned in this presentation. Bacterial meningitis is a disease in which the meninges of the brain are inflamed, and it is caused by bacterial species. Epidemiology studies the occurrence, transmission, prevention, and control of human disease, and is important for the safety and public health. Antibiotic resistance makes treatment difficult, and therefore vaccination is the best preventative treatment.